Woods has been one of my favorite classes I've ever taken in school, so for my senior thesis, I'm going to take you guys through what I've been working on. Heading into the workshop, you can see that there's a ton of stuff that we use to make our projects. The Woods room is run by two teachers, Mr. Bomer and Mr. Richard. As you saw before, when you enter Woods, there's a bunch of workbenches in the front of the room with a lot of tools and machines in the back. I have learned to use a lot of the machines like the bandsaw, miter saw, or table saw, and pretty much all the tools in the tool cabinet. Behind the machines, we have all the lumber we use to create our projects. We use a lot of different types of wood, like oak, maple, cherry, mahogany, walnut, ash, and pine. And walking up the stairs, we have more of the raw lumber that's stored away. We also have a spray booth where we lacquer all of our projects. Now, when you start the class, there's a lot of things you have to learn before you begin creating our project. Safety and research being the most important things. There are a lot of safety precautions in the Woods room, one of the main ones being the dust collector. It connects every machine and sucks away all the sawdust while also filtering the entire room with 3 huge filters. Research is also very important. We spend about 2 weeks in the beginning of the year just brainstorming and figuring out what we want to create. Mr. Richards has us look through the internet for inspiration and ideas on what we can and cannot do. A back and forth discussion with Mr. Richards is also very important since he has the experience to help us make our ideas better. The next step in research is actually creating our idea in a 3D modeling software called SketchUp. Here you can see my first project of the year, which is a sideboard. And we do this to see if our idea looks like the way we want it to and to see the actual scale of how it'll look like. A sideboard is pretty much a fancy shelf. The one I made is about 5 feet long and 3.5 feet tall and made out of cherry. The entire process included a lot of steps, and I could probably spend a couple days just explaining every little detail, so I'll do my best to condense it down. First, I started off by cutting the legs and aprons out. I attached them together with dominoes and then added a slight curve on the bottom of the aprons with a custom sanding block and a spoke shave. Here you can see the legs and aprons are fitted together. The next step was getting the tops of each shelf together, so I glued them together and sanded them with an orbital sander and a hand plane, as well as lacquering them before cutting them to their final size. The glue up for my sideboard was really hard. I couldn't just glue the frame together and slide the boards in, so I had to glue the frame together while the boards were already inside, which took me around 45 minutes. After that, I sanded the entire thing again and put more layers of lacquer on it, and here it is finished. Overall, making this sideboard took me about 6 months, and I finished it around the middle of April. For my next project, I wanted to create a nightstand, so I made another SketchUp model. And now, what you envision for your project pretty much is never exactly what you end up with, and within a week there are already a lot of changes since my original model. I didn't record much for the beginning of my nightstand, but the process was really similar. I originally wanted to use dominoes to attach the aprons and legs together, but Mr. Richards said that I should use mortise and tenon instead. I also didn't plan to add a drawer, but it came up while talking to Mr. Richards, so we scrapped the top apron and added 2 stretchers across to fit the drawer. I attached these with dominoes and glued them into place along with the entire frame. Here, you can see the process of cleaning up the excess glue from all the joints with a wet rag, and I pre-finished the frame in the spray booth after. I also fixed Mrs. John's clipboard when this was happening. And again, we made more changes that weren't originally planned. Mr. Richards had the idea of adding slats onto the bottom shelf rather than just a plain board, so here's me cutting the slats on the miter saw. I had to cut them to fit directly in between the front and back of the bottom aprons, so I had to sneak up on the edge and keep testing to see if they fit. Measuring out the size of each slat and the size of each gap took a little math, but it worked out in the end. I also cut some small strips that the slats would lay on, drilling holes in them on the drill press. Here, you can see I messed up pretty bad and read the tape measure wrong, so the crossbeam was 1/4 inch too low. But I fixed it pretty easily with another strip that I glued on top. The next thing I had to do was to process the slats that I had cut, so the ones in the ends would have to get their corners cut, and here's me doing that on the table saw with the miter gauge. I got the majority of the corners cut out, and I took off the last couple millimeters on the bandsaw here. And then for the other slats in the middle, I just chamfered the edges with a router and sanded all of them down with sandpaper. The final step for these was just lacquering them in the spray booth. I attached them in the frame using the drill and impact wrench. The trick I learned was to put a piece of masking tape on the drill bit so you don't drill through to the other side. The next thing I had to do was make these L-shaped rails for my drawer to slide on, so I cut and glued these two pieces together and drilled holes into the side. I cut them exact enough to where I could force fit them to see if they were the correct measurements, and then I added a small bevel in the back and drilled them into place. Now it was time to make the drawer. I found and cut the lumber to size and then hand planed the inside face before attaching it to this dovetail jig to make a dovetail box. It was my first time making a box with dovetails, so my glue up was a little sloppier than usual, but I had Jack help me record when my phone fell over. I also pre-finished the inside faces before so the glue wouldn't show up under the lacquer. After the glue up, I used the belt sander to flatten the sides and make sure that the dovetails were perfectly exposed without any glue. Mr. Richards then helped me with shaving down the box with a block plane and a hand plane so that it would fit and slide smoothly in and out. And now, here's me making the bottom part of the drawer. I used the table router to cut out a portion of the frame to make a rabbeted bottom, and then found and cut a piece of plywood to fit, rounding the corners on the belt sander. And one last step for the drawer is to cut out a hole in the front so I could open the drawer, which I used inspiration from my own cabinet at home for. After I drilled the holes into the corners, I used the jigsaw and a Japanese handsaw to cut across the front. From there, I used a chisel and sandpaper to smooth out the cutout. And here you can see Mr. Bummer let me use a chisel that his great-grandfather used to use. And now, the final step for my nightstand, the top. I found some lumber upstairs and cut it to size on the miter saw. Another small detail when gluing up a large slab like this is matching the grain on each piece. This is something that might seem small, but is really important since you want the final slab to have a seamless looking grain. After I took my slab out of the clamps, I put it through the planer to flatten the board and to get rid of a little twisting that the slab had. I then used a bunch of hand tools to smooth out the surface of the slab. So the first thing I used was a hand plane. Since mahogany has a lot of interlocking grain, I got a bunch of tear out as you can see here. So I used a belt sander to get rid of the tear out. The belt sander took out a lot of the material, including the tear out, but it also left a lot of deep scratches in the slab, as you can see here. So the next step was grabbing the orbital sander, and I sanded the slab from 80 grit all the way to 220 grit. And then at the end, I added a small chamfer on the edges of the slab just to finish it. And in total, this took me about 3 hours of sanding. And now all that's left are the finishing touches. So here I am spraying the drawer and the top of my nightstand in the spray booth. And Mr. Richards is here helping me flatten the top of the frame on the table saw and preparing it to get fastened to the top here with these fasteners. And here is the finished nightstand. Overall, this project taught me a lot about the importance of planning and how to improvise when things don't go exactly the way you planned. I had a lot of fun creating this nightstand, and I learned a lot of things along the way, and it was an amazing experience for me. For my book, I read A Place of My Own by Michael Pollan. It follows the process of him building his own space in his backyard, a place of his own, and all the things he learned along the way with the challenges he faces when building. Something that was very similar to what I experienced while making my nightstand.